The vast wilderness of North America is no longer a silent frontier. To the east, Britain's 13 colonies are growing restless, their population booming and hunger for land pushing them west. To the north, France has built a chain of mighty forts, guarding its territory and trade routes like a watchful hawk. Between them lies the Ohio River Valley, a land rich in resources, home to powerful native nations, and claimed by both empires. One skirmish here will ignite a conflict that rages across forests, rivers, and oceans. A war that begins in the Americas, but soon engulfs the world, forever reshaping the fate of nations. This is Era Hive, where history speaks. Tensions in the Ohio Valley. In the early 1750s, the Ohio River Valley was more than just a stretch of untamed wilderness. It was the beating heart of a continent's future. Towering forests, winding rivers, and fertile soil made it a prize every empire desired. For Britain's colonies, it promised land for settlement and wealth from trade. For France, it was the key link between Canada and Louisiana, the backbone of its North American empire. But this land was far from empty. It was home to powerful native nations, the Shawnee, Delaware, and most importantly, the Iroquois Confederacy, who controlled the flow of trade and alliances in the region. These nations were not passive spectators. They were skilled diplomats and warriors, playing European powers against each other to protect their lands. Tensions began to simmer when British settlers, hungry for new farmland, started pushing west past the Appalachian Mountains. French traders and soldiers responded by building a chain of forts, Fort Presque Isle, Fort Le Boeuf, and Fort Duquesne, effectively claiming the territory. Each fort was like a warning sign. This is France's land. To the British, these forts were an open challenge. To the French, the British encroachment was a direct threat. And for the native peoples, this was a dangerous balancing act. Choosing the wrong side could mean the loss of their homeland. By 1754, the powder keg was ready. All it would take was one spark to set the frontier ablaze. And that spark was about to come from a young, ambitious Virginian named George Washington. Washington's first mission. In the spring of 1754, a 22-year-old major in the Virginia militia, George Washington, was given a mission that would change his life and the continent's future. His orders: travel deep into the contested Ohio Valley and demand that the French abandon their forts. It was a bold task for someone so young. Washington set out with a small party, navigating through dense forests, swollen rivers, and muddy trails. The air was heavy with tension. Every bend in the trail could hide a French patrol or a native war party. When Washington finally reached Fort Le Boeuf, the French commander received him politely but firmly. The message was clear. France had no intention of leaving. Washington returned to Virginia with the news, and an unshakable sense that war was inevitable. Months later, the British governor of Virginia sent Washington back, this time not as a messenger, but as a soldier. His mission? Secure the forks of the Ohio River before the French could. But the French had moved faster, constructing Fort Duquesne on the very spot the British wanted. In late May, Washington's scouts discovered a small French detachment in the woods. Believing they were about to be attacked, Washington ordered a surprise strike. The skirmish lasted only minutes, but the outcome was explosive. Several French soldiers were killed, including their commander, Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. What Washington didn't know was that this incident would ignite a global war. To the French, it wasn't just a skirmish. It was an assassination, and they were ready to retaliate. The Battle of Fort Necessity. After the Jumonville skirmish, Washington knew the French would come for him, and they wouldn't come alone. He pulled his men back to a small meadow in the Great Meadows area and began constructing a makeshift stockade. It was hardly a fortress, just a crude circular palisade of logs, barely high enough to offer real protection. He called it Fort Necessity. On July 3, 1754, the French counterattack arrived. Around 600 French troops and hundreds of Native American allies surrounded Washington's position. Rain poured down, turning the fort into a muddy pit. Washington's muskets misfired in the wet weather, while French marksmen picked off his men from the tree line. By evening, Washington's situation was hopeless. Ammunition was low, casualties were mounting, and there was no chance of reinforcements. The French offered terms. Washington could surrender and march his men back to Virginia, but he had to sign their document. The catch? Buried in the French-language surrender paper was an admission. Washington had assassinated Jumonville. Washington, not fluent in French, signed it without realizing the political consequences. The surrender was a humiliation. Washington returned home defeated, but his actions had already set the wheels of war turning. The British and French were now locked on a path to full-scale conflict, and the young Virginian had earned both fame and infamy. Britain strikes back. News of Washington's surrender at Fort Necessity reached London like a slap to the face. For the British, it wasn't just a colonial embarrassment, it was a direct French challenge to their claims in North America. The government decided it was time to send in professional soldiers. In 1755, they dispatched Major General Edward Braddock, a veteran of European warfare, to lead a full-scale expedition against the French stronghold of Fort Duquesne. Washington, now a provincial officer, joined Braddock as an aide. Braddock was confident, perhaps too confident. He marched nearly 1,500 redcoats and colonial militia deep into the wilderness, cutting roads as they went. But the army moved slowly, dragging heavy artillery through dense forest. The French, with their Native American allies, knew exactly where they were and set an ambush. On July 9, 1755, Braddock's column was attacked just miles from Fort Duquesne. The British line collapsed under musket fire from the trees, something Braddock's European tactics couldn't counter. The battlefield turned into chaos. Braddock was mortally wounded, and it was Washington who rallied the survivors and led the retreat. Bullets tore through his coat and hat, but somehow he emerged without a scratch, a fact that would later fuel legends about his divine protection. The defeat was devastating, but Britain was now fully committed to war, setting the stage for a global conflict that would rage not just in America, but across Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. The French and Indian War had truly begun. A string of defeats. The disaster at Braddock's Field was only the beginning. Over the next 2 years, Britain's fortunes in North America sank even further. In 1756, France formally declared war on Britain, turning what had been a colonial conflict into part of the wider 7 Years' War. The French launched bold offensives, seizing British forts along the frontier. At Fort Oswego on Lake Ontario, French forces under the Marquis de Montcalm captured more than 1,000 British troops in a stunning victory. The following year was even worse. In 1757, Montcalm struck again, this time at Fort William Henry in the Hudson Valley. After days of siege, the British garrison surrendered. But as the defeated soldiers marched away under terms of truce, some of the French's native allies attacked, killing and capturing dozens. The event shocked British colonists and became infamous in propaganda, fueling hatred toward both the French and their allies. Meanwhile, Britain's colonial militia forces were plagued by poor training, lack of coordination, and deep mistrust between provincial leaders and royal officers. Supplies were scarce, morale was low, and the French seemed unstoppable. By the end of 1757, it looked as though France might secure total dominance in North America. But change was coming. In London, a new political leader, William Pitt the Elder, would take control of Britain's war effort, reshaping strategy and turning the colonies into the centerpiece of Britain's global ambitions. Pitt's bold new strategy. In 1757, Britain's war in North America seemed doomed. Then came William Pitt the Elder, a man with vision, energy, and a flair for bold action. Pitt understood something his predecessors had not. The colonies weren't just a distant theater of war, they were the key to defeating France on a global scale. If Britain could drive France out of North America, it would weaken them everywhere. His plan was simple but revolutionary. First, he poured massive resources into the colonial campaign. More troops, more ships, and more money. He worked to ease tensions between British commanders and colonial militias, offering to reimburse colonial governments for raising and supplying troops. This move instantly boosted recruitment. Second, Pitt appointed dynamic and aggressive commanders, men like James Wolfe and Jeffrey Amherst, who were willing to take risks and move fast. Third, he embraced Britain's naval power. By blockading the French coastline, the Royal Navy cut off supplies and reinforcements to New France, slowly starving their war effort. By 1758, the results were showing. British forces captured Louisbourg, the fortress guarding the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Lawrence River. This opened the gateway to Canada itself. That same year, British troops also seized Fort Frontenac and Fort Duquesne, striking blows deep into French-held territory. The tide had turned. What had begun as a series of humiliating defeats was now a campaign of steady, calculated victories. And the most daring move of all, the assault on Quebec, was just over the horizon. The road to Quebec. By 1759, the war in North America had reached its decisive phase. The British, energized by Pitt's leadership, now aimed at the heart of French power, Quebec City. Perched high on cliffs overlooking the St. Lawrence River, Quebec was the key to controlling all of Canada. The plan was audacious. General James Wolfe, only 32 years old, would lead a fleet up the St. Lawrence River. Lawrence, bypassing French forts along the way. Meanwhile, General Jeffrey Amherst advanced from the south, and smaller forces pressed from the west, squeezing New France from all sides. But reaching Quebec was no easy task. The St. Lawrence River was treacherous, its channels winding through hidden reefs and strong currents. French defenses lined the shores, and the city itself sat like a stone crown on its rocky perch. Wolfe's arrival sparked a tense standoff. For weeks, the British fleet bombarded Quebec while Wolfe probed for weaknesses. The French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, refused to be drawn into open battle, knowing the city's defenses gave him the advantage. The summer dragged on. Disease and hunger wore down the British troops, and the river's icy winds hinted that winter was approaching. Wolfe knew he had to act soon, or retreat in failure. Then came the daring plan that would change history. A nighttime ascent of the cliffs west of the city, landing at a narrow cove the French thought impossible to climb. If successful, it would put the British on the plains of Abraham, forcing Montcalm to fight on open ground. The Battle of Quebec. On the night of September 12th to 13th, 1759, the British fleet slipped silently upstream under the cover of darkness. In small boats, soldiers paddled toward a narrow landing spot just west of Quebec, known as the Anse-au-Foulon. The moon hid behind clouds, and the current carried them swiftly along. At the shore, a steep, twisting path climbed the cliffs, a route the French considered too dangerous for an army. Wolfe's men began the ascent, gripping roots and rocks in the darkness. By dawn, they emerged on the heights above, forming ranks on the plains of Abraham. Montcalm awoke to shocking news. The British had bypassed his defenses and stood ready for battle within sight of Quebec's walls. The French general knew he had little time to wait for reinforcements. He marched his forces out of the city, determined to drive the British back before they could dig in. The battle began mid-morning. The French advanced quickly, firing as they came, but the British held their line, muskets leveled. Wolfe had ordered his men to withhold fire until the enemy was within just 40 yards. When the signal came, a devastating volley tore through the French ranks, followed by a second and third. Both commanders were mortally wounded in the fighting. Wolfe was struck 3 times but lived long enough to learn that the French were retreating. "Now God be praised," he is said to have whispered. I die content." Montcalm, also gravely wounded, died the next morning inside the city. By evening, the French defenses collapsed. Quebec fell into British hands, marking the decisive turning point of the French and Indian War in North America. The fall of Montreal. The capture of Quebec in 1759 had dealt a crushing blow to French power in North America. But the war was not yet over. French forces still held Montreal, the last major stronghold in Canada, and they hoped for reinforcements from Europe. But the British, determined to finish the campaign, planned a three-pronged assault for the summer of 1760. From the west, General Jeffrey Amherst marched down the St. Lawrence River. Lawrence River with a large army, capturing French posts along the way. From the south, Colonel William Haviland advanced up the Richelieu River, while from Quebec, General James Murray pushed upriver toward Montreal. By early September, the three British forces closed in, their combined strength overwhelming the smaller French garrison under Governor Vaudreuil. With no hope of escape and the population starving, Vaudreuil chose to negotiate. On September 8, 1760, the French formally surrendered Montreal without a battle. The Articles of Capitulation guaranteed religious freedom for French Canadians and protection for their property, terms that helped ensure a peaceful transfer of power. With Montreal's fall, all of New France passed into British hands. The war in North America was effectively over, though fighting would continue in Europe and other parts of the world for another 3 years. The Treaty of Paris and the end of the war. Although Canada had fallen, the wider 7 Years' War raged on in Europe, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. Britain and France continued to battle for supremacy on multiple fronts, each trying to improve their bargaining position before peace talks began. By 1763, both nations were exhausted. Britain's global victories had given it leverage in negotiations, but war debts were enormous. France, facing economic collapse, sought to preserve its most valuable colonies, especially in the Caribbean. The resulting Treaty of Paris, signed on February 10, 1763, redrew the map of the world. France ceded Canada and all its territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain, except the small islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon. Spain, which had joined France late in the war, ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for the return of Havana, Cuba. France transferred Louisiana west of the Mississippi to Spain, compensating its ally for the loss of Florida. Britain also gained significant territories in India and the Caribbean, cementing its position as the world's leading colonial power. For France, the treaty marked the end of its empire in mainland North America. For Britain, it was the dawn of an unprecedented global dominance, but one that came with new challenges. Governing vast new territories, managing indigenous relations, and paying off war debts would soon strain the empire and plant the seeds of future conflict. The war's impact on indigenous nations. For indigenous nations across North America, the end of the 7 Years' War was not a triumph, but a turning point, and not for the better. Throughout the conflict, Native leaders had engaged in careful diplomacy, balancing alliances with Britain and France to protect their lands, trade networks, and sovereignty. The French, while far from perfect partners, had generally maintained a system of mutual trade and military cooperation, relying on indigenous allies to hold the frontier. With France gone from Canada, that balance collapsed. Britain no longer had to court indigenous nations to counter French influence. British officials began imposing tighter control over trade, restricting the supply of ammunition and goods, and treating native leaders as subjects rather than allies. This shift fueled deep resentment and anxiety. The indigenous understanding of the war's end was different from the European one. They had not surrendered their lands. Yet the British increasingly acted as though victory had given them full authority. In 1763, these tensions erupted in Pontiac's War, as a coalition of Great Lakes and Ohio Valley nations rose up to resist British encroachment. The war underscored a truth the Treaty of Paris had ignored. Indigenous nations were not passive observers, but powerful actors in shaping the continent's future. The British response, the Proclamation of 1763, reserving lands west of the Appalachians for native peoples, was intended to prevent further conflict, but it also angered colonial settlers hungry for expansion. Thus, even as Britain celebrated victory over France, a new and complex frontier struggle was already taking shape. Legacy of the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War in North America, did far more than redraw maps. It reshaped the political, economic, and social foundations of the continent. For Britain, the war confirmed its status as the world's preeminent empire. Yet the victory came at an extraordinary cost, a national debt that nearly doubled. To recoup expenses, London turned to the colonies for increased revenue, introducing taxes and trade regulations that would soon ignite colonial resistance. For France, the defeat was a humbling blow. Stripped of its North American empire, it shifted focus to its Caribbean possessions and the European continent, nursing a quiet desire for revenge that would find expression 2 decades later, in support of the American Revolution. For the American colonists, the war fostered a new sense of unity. Militias from different colonies had fought side by side, and a shared identity as Americans began to take root. Yet it also sowed seeds of distrust. The British military's dismissive treatment of colonial troops and the imposition of new imperial controls after the war deepened divisions. For indigenous nations, the war was a turning point toward dispossession. The collapse of the French alliance system left them vulnerable to British policy shifts, land-hungry settlers, and future waves of conquest. In the grand sweep of history, the French and Indian War was not just the last great colonial conflict between France and Britain. It was the opening chapter in the revolutionary drama to come. The guns had fallen silent in 1763, but in the shadow of victory, the fuse of revolution had already been lit.